Howdy folks. Today we're going to take a look at Sequelize, which is an ORM that you can use to make some of your SQL queries a little bit simpler. What ORMs stand for Object Relational Models. They are essentially libraries that can allow the application to connect and create tables and make queries to them on your behalf. This can be really useful because if you're typing a lot of SQL queries all at once, you tend to get to the point where you start to make typos, you start to duplicate a lot of your effort, and so ORMs can help with both of those issues. So let's take a look. For starters, I've got a very simple system set up. I've got an index that uses a .env. My .env has all the stuff for to connect to my server, and I have a schema. So what we want to do, let's first create the appropriate MVC folders. So we're going to create controllers. We're probably not going to put much in controllers for this, but it's just good to get in the habit of it. Models, oops, models is not going controllers. Models and views. So we're probably not going to put anything in views or controllers for this, but you could if you were building a full MVC thing. We are going to be working mostly with models. So then let's install Sequelize. Sequuelize. I think that's how it's spelled. Let's check. That looks right. And letting it do its thing. There we go. Sequelize. So the first thing we want to make a connection to our database. So let's make a config directory, and inside that, let's make a Sequelize folder. So let's import it. Sequelize require Sequelize. And so then let's take a look at our documentation for Sequelize, and let's see exactly how we want to connect it. Documentation, getting started, install, we did that. So it looks like we can actually use a connection string, or it looks like it's database, username, password, but it's Sequelize, so it's not actually, there we go. So, new Sequelize. So it looks like from that documentation, we have database, username, password, and then some data and the host and the dialect. So I'm actually just going to copy this because this looks similar to what I want. Okay, so our database is actually in process m. So let's say process.m.db. The username is likewise there. DB user. It's always a good idea to have all of these things in environment variables just for security purposes. DB pass. All right, and then this final thing is going to be, let's see, our host is going to be process.m.db host. Our dialect, you can see there's a bunch of different things that this can connect to. We're just going to go with MySQL because that's the dialect that we want. And then ports equals Sequelize. So first thing we got to do after we've initialized this is let's make sure that it actually works. Sequelize equals require, so let's require our config. So to verify Sequelize, they have a method for this, which is a method that not only verifies that your connection to the database is good, but also synchronizes all of the tables that are necessary. So what that would be is sequelize.sync. Sync, it takes some options. We're not going to worry about those for now, but it's a promise. It returns a promise. So as soon as this promise is resolved, we can be sure the database is ready to go. Why do we care about that? Well, especially if you're working on a fairly large application, you probably don't want to send it to production and have people start hammering that system as soon as it comes up if the database isn't ready. because then they'll start making queries on a Sequelize system that isn't initialized. Maybe your database is in an awkward state because tables are still being created. That wouldn't be a good situation. So we want to make sure that if you're doing your app.listen, if you're using Express, that should go inside this promise. So it would be like .listen, oops, at this point. I don't have that. I'm just going to put my queries inside of here. So if we just run that, let's see what it does. Oh, it gives me an error. Please install MySQL 2 package manually. What does that mean? Well, Sequelize, I told it, hey, use the MySQL dialect. So what it's going to do is it's going to try to use the MySQL 2 package, which is the standard package for this. But Sequelize doesn't come pre-bundled with all these things. Otherwise, it would come pre-bundled with literally everything. And that would be just a lot of stuff. Like you saw how many databases they have. We don't want it to pre-bundle with all the libraries for every single one of those databases. We're only going to be using one of those usually. So we have to install it manually. Oops. MySQL 2. Okay. And there we go. And we'll run it again. All right. And you can see it says, hey, executing select 1 plus 1 as result. Now that is Sequelize's way of saying I didn't really have anything to do. I'm just verifying that the connection to the database is good. If the connection to the database was bad, we would get an error at this point. Okay, so now we've got Sequelize set up. Let's take a look at what our models are going to be. So first of all, I'm going to do an index. And then I'm going to do our first model. Let's make this the user model. Okay. So to make a model in Sequelize, models are essentially representations of tables. So the model is going to have all the fields of the table, and Sequelize is going to use that to determine what tables to create, what operations to perform on them, etc., etc. Okay, so what we're going to do then is we're going to import model, from Sequelize. And then Sequelize is class-based for these models. So we're actually going to say class user extends model. Now, if you remember from your classes, extending the model like this means that we're going to be able to inherit all of the fields and properties from model. And at this point, you can put other stuff in here. I'm not going to. So then let's say user, sorry, I should get a little ahead of myself. Now that we've created that class, we need to actually tell Sequelize to initialize that table. That's pretty important. So let's say user dot init. Okay, so now init takes two objects. The first one is going to be a field configuration object. The second one is going to be information, like meta information about the table. So let's look at a field. ID, an auto increment primary key ID is automatically created by Sequelize. Sequelize just takes care of that for you, which, you know, is pretty helpful, I think. So what does a user need to have? Let's just go with a name. Okay, so what do we put in here? Well, we probably want to put a type, but let's just double check to make sure that's the right thing. Sequelize model basics. It is type, so they use something called data types. Okay, so let's put, you can see they're using Sequelize define here. We're not doing that. We're using this model class, data types. Okay, data types dot string. Okay, and if you want to have like a not null, you can say allow null false. By default, I believe this is true. You can do a bunch of other properties here for like there's an auto increment property, there's properties for keys, etc., etc. So our next object in here, the only thing that's super important for us to care about right now is we need to actually tell the user what the Sequelize object is. So we have to require that. Config Sequelize. And then we just pass that in like that. This tells the initialization, hey, when you actually are creating this table, here's how you got to do it. Okay, so let's export that. And then we're going to actually import it through the models index. And there's a reason for this, and we'll go over that in a minute. Acquire user, and then I'm just going to just full export it again. This might seem redundant, but we will do some stuff in here later on that make it important. So now in here, user equals acquire models, which if you do that // on the directory, it automatically includes the index. So now if we run this again, you can see it does a couple other things. First of all, it says, hey, select the table where table name equals user. It says, hey, does this table already exist? No, it doesn't. Okay, create it. And you can see it's created it with an integer and a name that's used a varchar, not null. It also automatically adds these created at and updated at date fields, which are kind of useful. And that's its a primary key. And that's done. So before we go on a little bit, let's talk about how to do some common activities in here. So let's say we want to insert new data, which might be useful, right? So the first thing, everything in Sequelize returns a promise, so I'm just going to make this an async function so I can await those promises. So let us look at inserting. In order to insert, new user equals, we call user.create, okay? And we pass an object into it. And what are the properties of that object? The properties of that object are the fields that we want to import. Note, ID is an auto increment key, so we don't pass that in. Created that and updated that get automatically set by Sequelize, so we don't need to worry about those as well. In this case, the only thing we need to worry about is the name. So what I'm going to do, console.log, new user, similar to, well, I guess not similar to MySQL 2. Sequelize will actually return an instance of the new user, the full object. So let's run this, and you can see we've got our name, our ID, our updated at, our created at. This is actually not a plain object. This is an instance of the user class. So we've got this class user here. Sequelize will actually return an instance of this user with those data values on it, which can be really useful. You can still say new user.name, stuff like that, and it'll access that. But it means also if you define any functions on that user class, you can call them on here. And if we take a look at our MySQL, base testdb, oopsie, use testdb user. Now here's a thing to bear in mind. Sequelize automatically pluralizes your tables. So if you call it user and you say this is called user, it's going to create it as users. So users. You can turn that off as well as you want to. And you can see, here's that data, just like we wanted. Okay, well that's kind of useful, and that matches what we have in here. What if we want to select from the user? So let's say we've already got our user here. Let's say we just want to fetch Bob back. Okay, well, Bob user, we have a couple options there. There is fetch by, I believe it's fetch. Let's double check. It's either fetch or find. Model querying. Create. Find. Oh, it's find. Okay. So, we have findByPk. What does that stand for? Find by primary key. Okay. So, finding by the primary key, we're going to give it whatever ID we want. So, if I give an ID of 1, and note also I am awaiting this because all of these return promises. And I run that, and you can see now it gives me pretty much the same value. If I try to find by an ID that doesn't exist, it gives me null because it says, hey, I couldn't find that. And you can see it actually gives you the select query that it ran, which can be kind of useful. Let's say we want to actually find the user associated with the field Bob, though. There's also two options. If we know we're only looking for one, we can call findOne. And then the options, there's an object we pass into it, and then we give it a where clause. And we say, okay, where name Bob. Now, if we run that, you can see we get that same object, and it runs the same thing. Limit, and notice that limit 1 on there. If we want to find more than one, we can say find many. Run that. Oh, find many is not a function. Well, I must have got that wrong. What do we call it then? Oh, find all. Excuse me. Go back here. Find all, which is all we're matching here. And then you notice it gives us the same thing, but it gives it to us as an array because it's saying, oh, you might be expecting more than one. Find all, you actually don't have to give it a parameter. If you don't give it a parameter, it just lists everything. So you can see the query here doesn't have a where clause on it, whereas this query did have a where clause. So if you leave out that where clause, you just get the contents of the whole table, which might be what you want. Okay, so now that we're able to find Bob, let's look at how do we update Bob. Well, there should, I believe, be an update function. Let's double check. Audio query, getter settings, the where clause, simple update queries. It is update. Okay. And so update takes in a couple parameters. One, it's what are we changing? So let's say we want to change the name to Tom. The next is going to be that same options where we can pass in a where clause. And I could say like ID is Bob user.id. All right, and then once we're done with that, let's go and grab Tom user, which should actually be the same ID. So I'm going to use findByPk, give it the ID of actually the ID. All right, so if we run that, let's get rid of this console log actually. So what this is going to do, we're going to first find our Bob user, we're going to update their name to Tom, and we use the where clause here, and then we're going to fetch that new Tom user. Oh, something errored. ID has undefined value. I didn't like something about that. Okay, so the reason that this is happening is because Bob user is actually an array. Why is it an array? Because we're saying user.findAll. So I need to change that to findOne. There we go. Now that works. All right, so you can see it calls a select ID where name equals Bob. Then update user set name, update that where ID. You notice it sets the update at that timestamp whenever you change it. These question marks, those are there because Sequelize is trying to protect you against SQL injection. And then we've got this update here again. And now you can see our data values. The name is Tom. And also the update of that is done. Okay, so let's say now that we wanted to remove this user. User.delete. And delete takes in another where clause. Oops. So where ID Bob user.id. Okay, and then let's actually do it in here. And then let's grab this down here again. User, and then let's console log it. Oh, can't read property ID of null. That's index 23. Oh, because now, because I renamed it. All right, well, let's just take that out there, and I'm going to put 1 in here because we know that's the ID. Oh, user delete is not a function. All right, well, let's see what it is then. Model querying, simple delete queries. Destroy. Well, that's a much more, ooh, that just sounds scarier. Destroy. Okay. And there we go. Delete. And then when you select it again, you can see that we get null instead. So inserts are done with create. Selects are done with either findOne, findAll, or findByPk. Updates are done with update, and deletes are done with destroy. So that's all I think we're going to go over for now. In another video, I'm going to go over how to set up one-to-many and many-to-many relationships in Sequelize and how to do table joins with it. All right, I hope this was helpful, and I'll see you all in class.